Hello class, welcome to this lecture on externalities here in our course on principles of microeconomics. To give you a roadmap of this lecture, we're going to start by defining what externalities are, talk about the difference between positive and negative externalities, well, in the reverse order. Then we'll talk about something known as the Coase theorem, which is effective and used a lot in law and economics and in terms of bargaining. We'll talk about other solutions to externalities, and then we'll have a discussion on the difference between public and private goods as a result of rivalry and excludability, and then we'll conclude the lecture by talking about the tragedy of the commons. So this lecture is going to be talking about externalities, and so externalities by definition has something external associated with it. In reality, we talked about how our market equilibrium occurs where the point where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. So here we have a downward sloping demand curve, and we have an upward sloping supply curve, and then we have quantity and price, and then this intersection point gives us an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. And we assume that's the most efficient solution in the market, and that's where the market clears and everything is great. The problem is that operates under the assumption that there are no external benefits or external costs, meaning that there are benefits that the consumer does not receive but society receives, or external costs that society has to bear that the firm or whoever is producing or consuming it is not taking under consideration. And so if that's the case, then this equilibrium that we've established before is actually inaccurate. That is still our market equilibrium because the firm and the consumer are not incorporating those benefits and costs that may be external to them. But it's not the efficient equilibrium. It's not efficient. And so the reconciliation that we're going to have to discuss is what are some types of external costs and external benefits, but also how do we get it so that the person that's taking on the consumption or production of this process actually incorporates that into their decision-making process, so that way society is not underwhelmed in terms of its benefits or overwhelmed in terms of costs that it shouldn't have to be responsible for if we force the responsible party to actually factor that into their cost or their benefit when they decide to buy or produce and sell the product. So again, just to recap, the official definition of externalities that you'll be responsible for knowing is a benefit or cost that affects someone who is not directly involved in the production or consumption of a good or service. So again, if they're not directly involved, so if they're not represented by the demand curve in terms of a consumer, or they're not represented by a firm in terms of the supply curve, then we're treating it as an externality if there's a benefit or cost that's not being captured in those respective curves, if we're looking at it graphically, or just in general if we're looking at it in a more kind of abstract perspective. So the reality is that we can divide costs and benefits into private and social costs and benefits. So the reality is that whatever the firm or the producer of a good or service is bearing is known as the private cost. And if we are in a situation where the market equilibrium is the efficient equilibrium, then in that circumstance, the private cost is going to be equal to what's known as the social cost, which is the total cost of producing the good or service. So the social cost is going to incorporate not only that private cost, but is also going to add in any external cost that society has to pay for as a result of that good or service being produced. It could be pollution, it could be noise, it can be inconveniences, nuisances, essentially any sort of cost that's going to be carried on by people that are not participating in the market system for this good or service. Those are going to be external costs, and when you sum that up with the original private cost, that is what's known as your social cost. Now, if there are no external costs, then our private cost is equal to our social cost, and then if that's the case and we don't have any positive externalities where there's a social benefit that's different than the private benefit, then our market equilibrium that we've already calculated is just fine, and it's correct the way it is. However, that may or may not be the case depending on circumstances. So, we can also look at it from the other perspective. It isn't always just about cost, it's also about benefit. So there are going to be circumstances in which individuals are going to have a specific level of benefit that dictates how much they're willing and able to pay for a good or service based on the level of utility or benefit or satisfaction that they're going to get from consumption of that product. But there are going to be situations in which society actually benefits from the consumption of that product by that individual that is not capturable in terms of themselves. So maybe an employer or maybe society benefits from a person being healthier because of the fact that they're now more productive. But again, society benefits from that, but I don't benefit from that. So I'm not going to be this altruistic person that's going to actually pay for someone else's benefit. And so that's where we have this situation of a positive externality, where there's actually an external benefit that society can receive if you incorporate and consume that good or service, but you're not willing to pay for that because you don't actually get the benefit from it. Someone else does. So why would you pay for it? So again, external costs are going to create inefficiencies in our market. So previously we talked about how government interventions such as a price floor or a price ceiling can really prevent us from being able to be at a efficient equilibrium, that market equilibrium where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. Now I'm saying that even if we are at quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded and at that market equilibrium, we could actually still be creating deadweight loss like we did before. So if we had a price ceiling that prevented us from getting to equilibrium, if we had a price floor that prevented us from getting to equilibrium, or we have a tax imposed that prevents us from getting to equilibrium or shift to a new equilibrium, then we had deadweight loss. So before the example was, okay, we have demand curve, supply curve. Oh no, we have this price ceiling, so we can't get to equilibrium anymore. So now we're producing here, and so this triangle right here represents the deadweight loss. Now what I'm saying is we're still getting to that equilibrium that we could get to before, but as a result of there being external costs that we can't actually represent in that model because the actual firm is not bearing that cost, we're going to eventually have deadweight loss again. And the way we're going to demonstrate that is we're going to draw a new supply curve as if the firm was actually paying for it. So if we shift to the left here and we're operating here, then this overproduction of the good or service, so this is market equilibrium and this is efficient equilibrium, as we'll see in the next slides. And so by being in a situation where we're overproducing, this triangle right here is now going to represent our deadweight loss. So when we have overproduction of a good or service, this deadweight loss is instead of saying it's a loss in economic surplus, you can still look at it from that perspective. But really what it's telling you is that we now have an added cost that society is taking on. So it is still loss in economic surplus, but in a way it's actually more added cost. So that triangle represents, in terms of a dollar value, the monetary cost of the overproduction of that good or service. So hopefully this does a better job of visualizing it. So the way we represent externalities in our supply and demand model is, again, we have the point where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded, so we have our market equilibrium right like before. And so we have an equilibrium price at market equilibrium, we have an equilibrium quantity at market equilibrium. The problem is that that is not factoring in the total external costs in addition to the private costs. So that original supply curve S1 is going to represent the marginal private cost. So again, we'll learn later on in the semester that a supply curve is a marginal cost curve, and marginal means additional, so it's the additional cost. So really, in the market equilibrium, it's the private cost that is being measured by the supply curve. But unfortunately, because of the production of electricity in this example, it's polluting the atmosphere and there's creating acid rain, which is going to affect water, it's going to damage buildings, and there's going to be a cost associated with that damage. But the firm's not paying for it, but someone's paying for it. We're paying for it as society and taxpayers and things like that. And so when you add in that external cost to the private cost, you get a new supply curve, which is known as the marginal social cost curve. And it should make sense because remember when we were talking about the variables that shifted supply, when it was an increase in the cost of inputs or an increase in the price of an input, you can treat pollution as an input if the firm is actually responsible for paying for it, and that would result in a shift to the left of the supply curve. So when we factor in those external costs, we now have a new supply curve at S2, that's our marginal social cost, and that's going to intersect the demand curve at a different point. That's going to be known as our efficient equilibrium. And so we're going to have a price and a quantity at a new equilibrium, and that's going to be known as our efficient price and our efficient quantity at our efficient equilibrium. And so the reality is that if the firm bears the cost of their actions, we would actually produce at an efficient equilibrium that is at a smaller quantity than our market equilibrium. So in reality, that yellow triangle that's being represented in the graph is going to be our deadweight loss, and that deadweight loss is representing the overall external cost that society is having to pay as a result of the firm not being held accountable and not producing at the efficient equilibrium like they would if they were actually held accountable for those costs. So a negative externality, so before you're used to the deadweight loss triangle kind of being to the left of the equilibrium point at that new quantity because that's the quantity at market failure. But what's weird now is we actually have a market failure at an equilibrium. So now we have to figure out, okay, how much is the cost? If that's being borne, that's shifting the supply curve to the left. When the supply curve shifts to the left, we're at a new equilibrium. And that new equilibrium, if we're not there, if we're at the market equilibrium instead, is going to create deadweight loss. That's an increased cost. So that's going to be reflected by the yellow triangle to the right of the efficient equilibrium. So it's the difference between the efficient equilibrium and the market equilibrium going up from the original marginal private cost supply curve to the marginal social cost supply curve, represented by that yellow triangle. Now, again, just because we tend to think of external costs as bad and pollution is bad and things are bad, that doesn't mean that that's the only type of externality. It's the most common expression of an externality, but it's not necessarily the only type of an externality. So we can also look at it from a benefits perspective. So in the previous slide, we assumed that the marginal private benefit was equal to the marginal social benefit when it came to the context of that externality with the pollution. But now let's just say that there are no external costs, and so our marginal social costs and our marginal private costs are going to be the same. So there's no negative externality now. But what if there's an external benefit for, say, going to school? So you going to school and getting an education provides benefit beyond just to you. It provides benefit to your employer, it provides benefit to your family, it provides a benefit to the government and society because you can earn more, pay more taxes, and a more competent employee and representative of the workforce in the country really provides benefits for everybody, not just you. But you're not going to pay for that. You're not going to pay for the benefits for other people because you don't actually get rewarded for that. Everybody else gets rewarded for that for you existing, but you don't. So you're only going to pay as much as you're willing to pay based on the benefits that you're distinctly going to reap the rewards of. And so if that's the case, then there's actually an underutilization of the good or service being consumed due to the fact that there is a greater good and a greater level of benefit than what we perceive when we buy things, but unfortunately, because we can't see it and because we don't care, we're not going to pay for it. So that's also going to create deadweight loss, but it's going to be more kind of like what you saw before with the price floors and price ceilings, where basically A positive externality, even though it's positive and sounds great, it's still creating deadweight loss and essentially a inefficiency or a market failure. So here's a graph of a positive externality. So a positive externality is going to be affected on the demand side. So a negative externality is on the supply side, and a positive externality is on the demand side. So this is going to be representative of a positive externality associated with education, college education. So the reason why you're in this class is to get some sort of beneficial college education, whether it be an associate's, a bachelor's, master's, PhD, professional degree, doesn't really matter. You're here to get some level of education beyond what you currently have. And so the reality is you're willing and able to pay up to the point where the additional dollar that you spend gives you additional dollar in returns in terms of benefit from going to school. Otherwise, there would be no point in going to school. So the reason why people go to college is because there's a significant return on that investment. So even though it feels like we'll never pay our student loans off and things of that nature, and there's discussion about reforms and paying for higher education, things like that, you still on average with an associate's make an extra few $100,000. With a bachelor's, it's about $1 million. With a graduate degree, it's about an extra $2 million over a high school graduate in your lifetime, which is still a lot more than even if you go to school forever like I have and rack up a ton of debt like I have. It's still a lot more money than I'm ultimately going to end up paying and hopefully getting discharged in debt, because I don't know how I can pay it off based on the flow of my income, but it'll happen. Regardless, it should make sense that you're only willing and able to pay up to the point in which you receive the last dollar of benefit. So market equilibrium is going to be where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded at the point where your marginal private benefit is being realized. So the demand curve D1 is representing your marginal private benefit. So again, we have a market equilibrium here. But again, like I'm saying as before, just because we're at equilibrium doesn't mean we're at an efficient point or the most efficient point in the market or in the system. Because there's a bunch of benefits, as I mentioned before, that society receives from you going to school. And when that's the case, then you have to factor in if we were to actually capture that external benefit and we actually had individuals privately paying for the benefit to society in addition to the benefit that they get for themselves, then we would actually be operating at D2, the demand curve, the marginal social benefit curve, and we would operate at that efficient equilibrium. But unfortunately, if we're not operating at that efficient equilibrium and we're operating at the market equilibrium instead, that yellow triangle there, which kind of looks more like the one you saw with the rent ceilings and the price floors, is going to represent the deadweight loss. The loss in economic surplus, so again, this is back to the way it was before, the loss in economic surplus that society is losing because you are not paying for something that someone else is getting credit for, which makes sense logically and incentive-wise, but unfortunately for society, they miss out on that unless they come up with some sort of solution. So again, we've talked about market failure before in terms of price floors, price ceilings, and taxes. If we're not able to achieve efficiency or a market clearing condition, then it basically is a market failure. So it's a situation in which the market fails to produce the efficient level of output. So again, we can have overproduction in the context of a negative externality. We can have underconsumption in the context of a positive externality. Both cases are market failures. So this is different than what we talked about before because we couldn't even get to equilibrium before. But now we're getting to an equilibrium. It's just not the right one. It's not the efficient level of output because we have lost opportunity with a positive externality from underconsumption, or we have overproduction and external costs that society has to pay for in some way, shape, or form the firm is not currently being held accountable to do. So the question now is, how do we get to efficient solutions? So there are three kind of categories. So command and control really speaks to a pollution negative externality context, but the other two can be remedies in both the context of a negative externality or a positive externality. And the first one is private bargaining. That's going to speak to the Coase theorem that I mentioned earlier. Pigovian taxes and subsidies, so those are in Pigovian represents Arthur Piguet, a French economist who suggested that maybe this is a remedy to externalities, and then command and control is just specific to kind of a negative externality to try and prevent pollution from being overwhelming. So the first one, which seems kind of odd, is the private bargaining solution, which is made famous by Ronald Coase. And so Ronald Coase is famous in the field of law and economics. So he didn't really intend this to be a law and economics thing. It just turned out to be the thing for law and economics. So if you ever take a law and econ course in some way, shape, or form, you will spend a lot of time on the Coase theorem. And the Coase theorem just says that if transaction costs are low, so that's the very important key there, is that you can't have super hostile parties, and the transaction costs of actually negotiating a deal have to be reasonable and reasonably low, then private bargaining will result in an efficient solution. So again, transaction costs are the cost in time, other resources that parties will incur in the process of agreeing to and carrying out an exchange of goods and services. So if you have two legal teams that are negotiating back and forth or on other sides of the world, it's going to be time consuming and costly, and it might not be as efficient as if they just went to court and argued over the merits of the case and let the judge decide or the jury to decide. The problem is that if you have ever go to law school or you ever become a litigator, you will learn that trial is a last resort. So trial is always leverage, and trial is a last resort because when you get to a judge or a jury, the randomness and the variability increases substantially versus when you negotiate a settlement before trial. And so you could get some inefficient results from going to court as well. So the hope is that if you can negotiate and settle out and hash out an agreement before you get to that point, it's most likely going to solve and remedy the issue in terms of the externality. Now, it could either be a situation in which the firm agrees to pay for their costs, or it could be a situation where the consumer or the households that are bearing the external costs pay the firm to stop polluting. So maybe they pay the firm to incorporate this pollution prevention technique, or maybe the company continues to pollute but then pays to compensate the households in exchange for the pollution, or a little bit of both. Both of them, all three of those solutions are considered equal in the Coase theorem. So even if it's the corporation at fault, even if it's the households that take the onus and responsibility to solve the problem, it's still treated the same because the external cost goes away and we're actually producing at an efficient level once again. On the other hand, we have Pigovian taxes and subsidies. So again, Pigovian taxes and subsidies are basically going to be taxes like we talked about before, but before we were just imposing taxes for the sake of imposing taxes, and we thought that it might be a beneficial thing. But if the market was efficient and there were no externalities before, then the tax actually creates deadweight loss and loses economic surplus. This situation is different. This is a situation where the tax revenue is to incentivize or increase the cost of the polluter in the context of a negative externality. And so basically what we're doing is we're trying to go from an inefficient equilibrium to an efficient equilibrium by increasing the cost of the firm and basically forcing them to cut their supply because their costs that they're incurring are higher, and producing at the efficient level of output. On the other hand, we could also have subsidies which incentivize people to otherwise who wouldn't take advantage of a positive externality because of the fact that they don't see the benefit in paying for someone else's benefit. They only see the benefit in paying for their own benefit. If we subsidize that difference between how much they would have to pay if we were operating at that efficient equilibrium, we're factoring all the benefits to society and not just the private benefits to society, and the actual cost that the firm is, or excuse me, the consumer is willing and able to pay, then we end up at an efficient solution and incentivizing people to actually do something that they otherwise would not do because the actual cost is at the point in which they're willing and able to pay and not higher like it was before. And then lastly, command and control basically focuses on the government imposing quantitative limits on the amount of pollution. So this is something known as cap and trade, where basically there could be so much carbon that's being produced, but the government wants to have certain limits and quotas that want to be met to try and help protect against climate change or try to help against health risks that are associated with the pollution in certain areas. And so what they will do is they'll say, hey, this is the amount of carbon that can be emitted by all businesses in the country. And if you want to pollute, then you got to buy a permit. And it's going to be auctioned off and it's going to go to the highest bidder. And if you don't have that permit, then you better find a solution to not pollute and still produce your product because you can't do it or else we'll shut you down. So that's a solution. It has some different outcomes than maybe a tax or a subsidy or a Coase theorem, but it is one remedy that governments are trying to implement or have tried to implement in the past. So here's an example of a Pigovian tax being implemented. So again, as I told you, if we treat the tax as a cost of an input or a price of an input like we talked about when we were talking about supply and demand, if it's an increase in the overall production of the product, and it doesn't matter if it's a tax or if it's another good or whatever, it's going to have the same effect on supply. It's going to shift us from the right at S1 where it was the marginal private cost, and now we're going to shift it to S2 where the marginal private cost plus the tax is going to ultimately be equal to the marginal social cost. So the tricky part for the government is to figure out what is the appropriate amount to charge on this tax that's going to be essentially equal to the costs that are being borne by society. So how much is the healthcare rising or pollution rising costs in terms of acid rain and building maintenance as a result of these actions, and we will try to tax them at that rate. So when you do that, you shift the supply curve back from S1 to S2, and now you end up going from your market equilibrium without the tax to a new market equilibrium, and that market equilibrium with the tax is now the efficient equilibrium because it omits that deadweight loss that we had before. And so effectively the price received goes down, the price that's paid by consumers goes up, and we have this new equilibrium that helps prevent us from overproduction. But we can also look at it from the context of a subsidy. So if we're trying to induce students to go to college, well, we have our market equilibrium, we're having quite a few students go to college and they're paying price P, but the reality is that, or excuse me, P market at our market equilibrium, but the reality is if we want to get more students, the amount of students that we believe should be going to school so we can capture all of those external benefits as well as the private benefits for the individuals going to school, we want to shift from D1, which is our marginal private benefit, to D2, which is our marginal social benefit, which is essentially going to be the marginal private benefit plus the subsidy. So the trick is that some people might think, oh, our subsidy should be equal to the difference between P efficient, represented by the intersection of demand 2 and supply, and P market, which is what the price what people were paying was before. The problem with that logic is that if you want to operate at Q efficient and you're basically representing it based on the willingness and ability at the private level, your actual price that you need to produce at is right there. Not here, because here you're still going to get the Q market quantity. You need to get the price down to here where the price is going to induce that many units of people to go to school. So the subsidy has to be between the actual market price that's going to be dictated by the college and the price that consumers are willing to pay, which is this gap right here. So it's important to know that's the level of subsidy that needs to be determined in order for us to solve the issue that we have here with a positive externality. I want to finish the lecture by talking about this concept of rivalry and excludability, because it helps us determine the relationships between what are known as private goods and public goods. So rivalry is just the situation that occurs when one person consuming a unit of a good or service means no one else can consume it. So rivalry is saying that because I am holding this product, no one else can have this product. Excludability is different, so it seems kind of like they're the same. We talked about excludability in the concept of property rights. And rivalry, you might think about winners and losers and things like that, and that should kind of make sense. Well, if I have it, then you don't, so I guess I'm the winner and you're the loser of possessing this thing that people want. Excludability is the situation in which anyone who does not pay for a good or service cannot consume it. So the reality is there are going to be certain goods or services that can't be excluded, and that's going to help us define what a public good is going to be. That basically, if I don't pay for the product, I don't get it. I can't free ride off of the product. So rivalry is just saying that if I have it, you can't have it. Excludability is saying that I can't get it for free. I have to pay for it. And if I'm not paying for it, I don't get it. And that should kind of make sense in the context of our graph, that the people that are getting are paying the price for it, and the people that aren't getting aren't paying the price for it. So there's essentially an excludability that's built into the supply and demand model. So depending on the relationship of rivalry and excludability, we can categorize goods into 4 different categories. So if we have a rival and excludable product, then we have a private good. So if I don't pay the price for a Big Mac or a running shoes or a cell phone, so let's say cell phone. So if I don't pay the price that Samsung or Apple or LG or whoever's producing phones these days, if I'm not paying the price for that product, I'm not going to get it. So it's excludable. But at the same time, once I buy my cell phone, everything that's on it, so the picture in the home screen, the accounts that are attached to it, the emails that I receive through it, the calls that I receive through it, the photos that I take from it are mine and mine only, and no one else can have this phone. I can share it, but generally speaking, because I bought that phone, someone else can't have the same phone. So a private good is something that is rival and excludable. Now, there are quasi-public goods which are non-rival, meaning that just because I paid for it doesn't mean that somebody else can't have access to it. So that's a quasi-public good. It's actually somewhere between public and private. It's not really public because it's excludable. If I don't pay for it, I can't have access to it. But it's also non-rival because if I go there and use the product or use the service, doesn't mean that someone else can. So an example of this is like streaming, or cable TV. So cable TV, I don't know how many of you still have cable TV anymore, but a lot of you might just be using streaming services like Netflix or Spotify or Hulu or Disney Plus or things like that. But basically, those streaming services are non-rival and excludable. I know some of them have a freemium kind of setup to it, so it might not be as quite the same, but let's say if it is a premium product where you either get it or you don't, basically if you don't pay the price, you can't stream and you can't listen to your music or watch your shows or things like that. But if you do pay the price, just because I have access to watch Friends or The Mandalorian or The Marvelous Miss Maisel or some other show that's on one of those streaming services, or my favorite musician or artist on Spotify or Apple Music or some other resource, doesn't mean that someone else can't be watching the same thing at the same time. So just because I paid to have Spotify doesn't mean I have now monopolized or monopsonized the access to my favorite artist's songs. Because someone else can also pay the price and also be able to access it. Now, if we have something that's rival and non-excludable, this can be a common resource. So a common resource is where we're going to get to the tragedy of the commons. So commons means a common resource. So if we go into the ocean, or we go to a lake, so I'm from the Great Lakes, so if we go out into Lake Erie or Lake Michigan and we want to catch some walleye or some trout or something like that, when I go out there and put my pole in the water and I catch something, it's rival because no one else can have that fish because I'm the one that caught it. But it's also non-excludable because it's essentially whoever catches the fish first gets it. So someone else could be in a boat near me and they can catch the same fish. So it's a rival because it's whoever gets it, but it's kind of a free-for-all as to who gets to it first. And then the last kind of category is a public good. So this is something that's usually provided by the government. It's not rival and it's not excludable. So when the government provides defense for our citizens by protecting borders or entering military conflicts and operations or providing humanitarian services, we don't necessarily have to, we have to pay for it in taxes, but even if we kind of evade our taxes and we don't get caught, they can't be like, well, you can't be protected by the military anymore. And at the same time, if the military protects one person, it doesn't mean that another person isn't protected. So also the same thing happens in the court system. So we can access the court system whether it's because we're being prosecuted or sued or we're suing someone else. Just because I'm using it doesn't mean someone else can't use it, and we can't really exclude people from access to it. So those four types of goods are all contingent upon the rivalry and excludability principles of those goods or services. Now, one of the consequences of a, say, non-rival and non-excludable situation is the free rider effect, and that's benefiting from a good without paying for it. So if you don't pay for your taxes, you still get this representation even if they don't catch you. So a more common example or more recent example of free riding has to do with unions. So a couple of years ago, there was the Janus v. Ask Me case, and basically that case said that even if you don't pay your union dues, you still have to be represented by the union in terms of collective bargaining and those other benefits. So effectively, it forced and allowed for people to actually be able to free ride off of the union system. So before it would be that if you wanted to be part of the union, you would pay dues and you would be represented in collective bargaining, or even if you weren't, because you were represented in collective bargaining anyways, you paid a smaller amount, so you didn't get quite as many benefits, but basically you were compensating the legal representation in the collective bargaining agreement. Now, since that case has been passed, it is entirely plausible where you could not pay your union dues or waive your willingness to pay union dues and just free ride off of the benefits. Whether that's ethical or not is another question, but it's legal now based on a Supreme Court case from a couple of years ago. So again, the last thing I want to talk about is the tragedy of the commons. So basically, this is just a tendency for a resource to be overused. So if you ever take an environmental economics course, I took one when I was an undergrad. We had a situation where we talked about the tragedy of the commons in the context of fishing and in the context of forests. So the reality is that fish and trees are both living things, and they both need to respawn and procreate and grow over an extended period of time, and it takes time for that to happen to maintain a healthy population. And the problem that happens is if you don't have something that's excludable, so in the context of common resources, we have non-excludability. We do have rivalry because if I get it, you can't have it. So if I cut the tree down and take it, you don't get the tree. Whether that means that you don't get the tree to cut down for yourself, or you don't get the tree as shade or access to it in terms of a national forest or a local park. You don't get access to its rival. So the problem is because of that non-excludability condition, you have a situation where if too many people are fishing too frequently, or people are cutting down too many trees, it doesn't spawn fast enough or regrow fast enough, and then you have depletion of the resource. And then there is a long-term consequence of the depletion of that resource. And so that's known as the tragedy of the commons. Is because it's a common resource, eventually you have overutilization, and then eventually it just kind of runs out. I am not a true environmental economist because I haven't done significant research in the field. I've done a preliminary research project in the past, but my intended goal was to be an environmental economist a couple years ago. And so a lot of the environmental economics type of conjecture and space and literature is really speaking to this problem. So it's talking about non-excludability. So the reason why we have national parks and national monuments is to protect a lot of spaces, protect either cultural history, but in more cases protect natural beauty and natural history, to avoid forests from being depleted, cut down, so they're still accessible for people. And so in the 70s, there was this creation of what's known as non-market valuation. You might read about this in a geography course, an environmental science course, or even an environmental economics course. Basically, because we aren't actually outwardly paying for a specific tree or a specific park to exist, we don't really have a market valuation for this. So in macroeconomics, we have the same concept when we're talking about GDP and household production. We do things for ourselves, but we don't necessarily have a dollar value that we can put on it because we're not actually paying ourselves or compensating ourselves. So what people have done, a lot of economists have done, and environmentalists, is we're taking the kind of estimated value of some of the economic benefits, so the tourism or utility or satisfaction that you get from utilizing something in a recreational setting, versus the kind of healthcare and overall economic prosperity benefits of those things existing. So maybe forests are cleaning out water, filtering water, trees are filtering carbon dioxide and providing oxygen, the soils are there for agriculture and things like that. All of those in existence have valuation that is beneficial, and we don't actually truly know the benefit of it until it's gone. And then effectively it just creates a huge increased cost for a small temporary benefit in a private setting. So that is the concept of the tragedy of the commons. And so that is kind of where environmental economics is stemming from, is this concept of negative externalities and trying to truly assess value of things and external costs, so that way we can come up with policies that indicate whether or not it's the right thing to do or not. So externalities are, I think, a pretty interesting topic. I wish I had enough time. I could have an entire class on environmental things, but for now, this hopefully will be a good enough broad understanding and explanation of externalities, so you understand it, kind of are slightly inspired by it, and if you have an understanding of kind of how things are affected when businesses or individuals are not truly bearing the full costs or benefits of their actions. So that concludes this lecture on externalities. Please let me know if you have any questions or concerns, or if there's any additional materials that you would like to request regarding this topic. Otherwise, best of luck on your assessments in this class and other classes, and I'll talk to you soon in the next lecture.